Hey, Mike.
Hello.
I think we're waiting for Brian. I know Jennifer's not able to join us, so Brian and Matt. And there's Matt on cue.
Good evening, everybody.
Hey, Matt.
Oh,
Let's wait one more minute for Brian. If not, we'll go ahead and get started and he can join us.
where's my? Okay, I lost the picture of the screen.
It might be behind something if you have something else open.
Strange.
And there's Steve.
Hello.
There we go.
Hoping Brian comes on here any second now.
Did you find it, Mike?
Yeah, I found the screen and I have the document open, but sharing it might be another challenge. So it's just odd how things get hidden.
Right. Okay, so it is 6:32 and let's proceed with opening our Finance and Facilities Committee meeting for October 13th, 2020. And for purposes of our audio recording and our YouTube recording, on the committee meeting Zoom with us tonight are board members Burl Piccolo-Antonio, Matt Campbell, and I anticipate Brian Harrison joining us at some point. Tonight we have 4 items for discussion on the agenda. And as usual, we start with the previous month and year-to-date financials. So I will turn it over to Treasurer Berlingo for that.
Okay. I'm going to try to see if I can share. Okay, when it says share screen, host disabled participant screen sharing. Oh, that's a problem. Okay. So I did email you the documents. Joe, I don't know if you can share. It says I can't.
Sure, I can do it.
Okay. So just the high-level summary of, September cash balances, 56.5. We're up about 300,000 over previous year, so somewhat consistent. We increased from last month due to collection of tax settlements. So the settlements that were delayed were received. Operating receipts for the month were below estimates for year to date by about 1.3 million, down 2.5 from prior year. We did not collect the rollback and homestead reimbursements from the state. Those were delayed. Typically, they would have been received in September, but have been delayed to October this year, which is kind of consistent with what's been happening throughout the crisis. Tax abatement TIF revenues were stronger than expected. So I'll talk about that a bit when we review the forecast assumptions. So I removed the hedge that I had put for in the May forecast. We did still have strong tax collections, although we are thinking that we might see a slight dip in the February, March collections for the second half of the year, because partly due to collection of taxes where people would have made payments through March, April, May, when the virus hit. We would not maybe have seen a reduction where people, because of unemployment and other issues, maybe kind of fell behind on those payments. So we are projecting a dip come beginning of next year. Expenses are about 800,000 under estimates, on par with prior year. Salaries, 438,000 underrun, partly because we have not settled the contract. So the wage increases that were anticipated to be in the forecast are not there yet. Benefit costs are up, mostly due to true-ups of prior year estimates. The pension surcharge, which was processed this month, and everything else typically due to timing. Appropriations, some slight changes to appropriations and revenues to 4 funds, additional allocations, nothing significant. The training for migration to state software, I did send out an email today to the board, basically indicating that we are going to delay the transition to the state software redesign until the spring of next year. We had discussions with Meta last week in anticipation of the potential strike and what that would do to the payroll department, and the effort needed to handle all of the changes and things that would occur in payroll. Because of the strike activity, we basically cannot spend the next 3 days in training. So therefore, they agreed to let us push this off till next spring, which would rather have made the switch over, but at the same time, if it's done this fiscal year, I think we're still in good shape. And then there's a transfer to the from the general fund for summer school related expenditures from last year. That's a normal thing that occurs every year. If we look at receipts, tax revenues, again, were higher than estimates by about $700,000 through September, about $369,000 over last year's amount. So again, they remain stronger than anticipated. Tax abatement revenues, actually, there was about $1 million increase over last year. And specifically in one particular TIF for Easton, saw a large increase in the amount that came through. So that is something that I'm looking at a lot more closely in terms of how that will impact the forecast. But certainly the hedges that we had put in the May forecast, we can reduce. All other items somewhat consistent. Dues and fees are down and will continue to remain so. Again, the rollback in homestead under state sources have not been received. They will come in next month and will be consistent then with prior year. On the expenditure side, again, about 800,000 under, mostly salaries and wages. Benefits are up again because of those true ups, and that'll normalize itself over the course of the year. The next page is the trend, the history. Again, the current year percentages are somewhat skewed. Those will be much more consistent once the rollback in homestead is received next month. What I think I'll do is add a column for the projected year amount so you can kind of see what it would trend to be if we are on expectations and on forecast. And the next is just a summary of our cash position. Investment earnings have deteriorated significantly as they continue to drop. Star Ohio is down to 20 basis points. It is actually down to 17 or 18 today. The Heartland Bank, 79 basis points is where I'm holding most of the cash because it's the highest return I can get on short-term money. Even longer-term paper where I've invested in some bonds and CDs are yielding 20 to 30 basis points. So significantly lower than what we had in the past. The one good thing is that our CD portfolio still has quite a few CDs that mature in 24 and 25 that are yielding, 3+%. So we will at least continue to receive some interest earnings over the next year or two. They won't be down to, at one point, Star Ohio, I think, bottomed out at 3 basis points during the last time interest rates approached these levels. The funds in Red Tree, 24 million or so, about 6 million of that will be transferred back to the general fund next month to pay for expenditures that have occurred in the building process. Any questions on the financial numbers at this point? Okay, I put in a levy summary. I think I do get a lot of questions, and I've had several phone calls recently from taxpayers and citizens relating to the bond issue and the levies. And I want to say there's a lack of understanding. It's just there's sometimes a lack of knowledge of how school funding works, especially due to the House Bill 920 reductions. And a lot of questions about the millage and what that's going to cost them. And are we going to get a windfall because housing prices are escalating by 18 to 20%. So just to show in summary, bond issues over the course of time here, our total bond millage that's been passed in Gehenna at 7.96, which is currently bringing in 2.15, reduced by 73%, operating down to by 49%. And the PI levy passed just 2 years ago is down 11% in terms of what it's yielding. So a 50% reduction in voted millage over the time period. Inside millage obviously does not change, so about a 48% overall reduction. The next page shows the detail. And I highlighted, these are all the levies that were on the ballot or bond issues. The ones in gray are ones that did not pass, and they're not included in the total millage. But you can kind of see the history and progression of when things were placed on the ballot and when they eventually passed. If you look at bonds in total, $85 million over a 33-year period. That on an average basis per year is about 2.7 million a year. That's hardly enough to kind of keep up with maintenance as opposed to build and construct new facilities. So the amount that's been raised in terms of bond issues in the district historically has been very low. The next section is all of our operating levies, continuing levies dating back to 1968. And you can see where, the millage passed of about 70 mils is down to 35.6. The last levy prior to the one passed in 18, there was a 5.2 mil levy 7 years earlier. So again, I think in terms of the number of times that we've gone to the taxpayers to ask for additional millage, has not been excessive. It doesn't, there are districts that are on the ballot just about every year, every other year due to growth and expansion. And then the next piece, the permanent improvement. Jeff, you could go back to that. Yes. At the bottom of that page, we have one PI levy on the ballot that was passed in 14 for 2.16 mils, down 11%. That's continuing. It does bring in 3.2 million or so in revenue for repairs and maintenance, buses, capital items, etc. But again, relatively small given the size of our district. So I think this is just a good chart so that people understand that what was passed in terms of millage is not nearly what we collect.
Mike, I think it's important for people to understand the reason that these rates have been adjusted downward is as property values increase, when we pass any issue, whatever the calculation is on the current housing building stock at that time becomes a known number. And that we can't in the future, based on that particular housing stock and commercial space, collect more than that in original calculation, which is why then the rate is adjusted downward. So it's called a fixed dollar calculation. So I think people think, as you said, as property appreciates, the districts, the schools win a bigger piece of the pie, but because the multiplier is adjusted downward to compensate, we are really at these adjusted levels. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for including that.
Okay, next, wanted to run through some of the assumptions and changes between the May and the November forecast that's currently being compiled. One, in enrollment, we're projecting through 2025. The last forecast in May was a 5-year forecast ending in 2024. This forecast that we're now compiling goes through 2025. The assumption was at the time we created or estimated the millage needed to support a levy, it was going to be a 4-year levy that would carry us through 2024. Adding the 5th year now is going to show some more negatives out in that 5th year column based upon the millage that we're asking for. But in terms of the student growth on the projection, if you take that 579 students divided by an average of 30, that's higher than a class size, but some of those kids will be dispersed throughout the district, not necessarily into one particular class. So I estimated about 19 teachers needed to support that growth. And that was in the forecast previously. So when you look at the next district head count, we had assumed Lincoln Elementary, we were going to hire some additional staff to handle additional students in a larger building. And plus with the additional district staff, there was the 19 that was incorporated in the prior forecast. We always have retirements and replacement staff. But I have now added some classified staff, specifically bus drivers, maintenance, and custodial, because as the number of students increases, we will need to add buses and bus drivers, as well as with more square footage of building space, other maintenance, and more custodial staff. So that will be baked into the forecast. State foundation revenues, we had the 1.6 million cut for FY20. That has carried through to FY21, and we had assumed the same impact for FY22. There's discussion amongst treasurers that we may potentially get back to full funding in FY22, or at least what was there for FY19. I'm not quite that optimistic, although the state budget has improved significantly over the last few months. Restrictions have been loosened, economic conditions have improved, and tax collections are down, but not significantly the way they were initially. So I'm going to lower that reduction for FY22 from 10 to 5%. So that'll give us some additional revenue in FY22. Property tax collections, a lot of uncertainty surrounding the economy back when we did the May forecast as to what the impact was going to be. We estimated that collections would be down by about 5% in the forecast. This was not necessarily a reduction. It was a reduction in the fiscal year 21, but we were anticipating that those collections would then materialize in 22, 23, and 24. So it really didn't have an overall impact on the forecast, but it certainly shifted dollars between years. So depending upon what we see now coming up in the spring, I'm going to adjust that reduction down to 2% as opposed to 5%, which all it does is basically shift revenue back to FY21 and lower the future years that we had anticipated collecting it. TIF and tax settlements remain strong. Again, they were up significantly over last year. And again, I think more analysis needs to be had in that area. But I do anticipate reducing the hedge that I had put in, because I thought if businesses are not or incurring significant losses, that could lead to issues in payment of TIFs and abatement revenue. That doesn't seem to be the case at this point. So I think reducing that hedge is something we can do. Health insurance premiums, we had assumed industry averages for medical and dental coverage of approximately 9%. We had 10 to 25% potential increases in our fund for insurance estimated, but in the actual forecast, we used 9. We've been advised that that increase will be 2.5%. So there will be a savings of about $700,000 per year due to insurance, lower insurance costs this year and then rolling forward. I'll still assume 9% going forward in future years. Eventually that will catch up to us. But our experience was good this past year, which led to the lower increase. One of the negatives on COVID-related costs, we assumed that we were going to start the year, back in school, even though we were receiving the COVID funds, which could have been used to offset recurring expenses due to the extended period of school closure, and more cost related to PPE and equipment and maintenance. It basically increased cost by $1.5 million in the forecast for this fiscal year. That offsets what we're receiving from the state and the federal government, plus some additional cost. Stipends, there were stipends for streaming. This may or may not be occurring now, given the situation we're in. So I had added some dollars in for that. Food service is still somewhat of a wild card. The forecast, the last one we did not require us to subsidize food service from the general fund, but we did assume that we would be in hybrid mode from October through December in that forecast, and that we would be back in school in January. If that gets delayed and we stay in hybrid mode, then obviously revenues are going to be lower, since we'll only be serving half the kids on a continuous basis. The other half, we may see additional federal dollars if they continue with this program of free lunch, because right now we're able to get more federal funding because of the free lunch program that they've extended to basically all students. So in the next month or two, we'll kind of have a better handle on where food service is headed. So when I plugged in adjustments to date, and if we look at where the forecast will be in FY24 and FY25, the days on hand cash, there'll be 58 days. which leaves us 2 days short of our cash goal of 60. And again, this is for FY24, which would have been the 4-year levy that we put the millage on the ballot for. Per day cost of 305,000, so we're short 630 some thousand. It's actually 2.3 days or so. I took out the decimals. So we're short 634,000 to get us up to our cash goal. The fund balance would be negative 22.6 million, but the reserve is projected at that point to be 16. If we leave the reserve at 2 million, that lowers the negative balance down to 8.6. So we need a total of about 9.2 million, which is 3,085,000 a year in reductions. So right now it's about 3.1 million a year shortfall in order to carry us through FY24. If we go to FY25, due to the 1 more year of increased expenditures and no necessarily large increase in revenues, that negative becomes much larger. And if we wanted to project out cuts needed to carry us through FY25, it'd be 5.4 million a year. But that's not what the intent of the levy was when we placed it on the ballot. It was a 4-year levy.
So can I ask a couple questions here?
Mm-hmm.
Your reserve, your preference would be to forecast our reserve at 2 million.
That's
despite
what
the
it
fact
is.
that we,
That's what it is currently. So
right, but
if
we had
I'm sorry.
plans to increase it over time.
Yes. So in FY24, that reserve was projected, forecasted to go to 16 million. But if we if we don't pass a levy, building a reserve would mean we would need to make significantly more cuts in order to fund a reserve. So I didn't see how we could be building a reserve if we were not bringing in the additional revenue to support that.
So define for me where that 14 million and the 17 million come from.
In the actual forecast, there's a line for reserves, and that if you take the cash.
So that's what we had projected in May.
Yes.
Okay,
That's what we would have projected at the end of 2024. We would have a 16 million balance in the reserve, and right now it's at 2. So if we don't build up the reserve, that 14 million that's currently in the forecast would be million. So the actual negative cash balance plus the shortfall for the 2 days is a shortfall about 9.3 million.
Okay, so I guess as board members, we will have to determine if 2 million is acceptable. I think a single payroll is how much?
We're pushing 3 million.
And if the state has some wild thing go wrong and they withhold another 1.6 million or more, then we will be dangerously close to having no cash with which to make a payroll, right? And I think as a board, we decided we did not want to be in that condition. So not that we need to make that determination here, but I think for modeling purposes, to present for May, I think we need to see it with a minimum, I guess, Matt, Earl, you can speak up, a minimum, a $3 million reserve balance, as well as a $2 million reserve. But if it's all used in FY24, then how does it appear again in 25?
Well, the model forecasts that we would be passing a levy at some point, right? This now removes any levy revenue. So what would happen is the actual cash balance, we do not pass a levy in the next 4 years.
I see.
Cash
Okay.
balance
All right.
is,
At the new levy. Okay.
yeah.
All right. Okay. All right. Thank you.
So I'll go through the detail of that when we actually compile the total forecast and look at all the line items.
Can I ask, back up in food service, how are you handling this anticipated or potential loss of like 300,000 a fiscal year?
I think at this point, that's the worst case. We would need to advance money from the general fund, and that would need to be put in as an additional expenditure.
So is it a line item in the,
It would go in as a transfer to food service.
so we're not budgeting it?
It's not in my numbers currently because I was hoping we'd get more data, kind of see how October comes in with the federal reimbursements. That'll give me a better idea of what October, November, and December are going to look like. And then if we're still not going to be back and staying high next, from January through May, I could then forecast out what that number actually is.
So in the May forecast, we would true up this
We
particular
can
line?
either do it there or I'll include a line item in the November. Again, once I have October, I think I'll have a better feel
Oh,
for
okay.
where it's going.
Okay, so October is really what you're waiting on, the data?
Yes.
Okay.
I got a question as far as how does that, the meals that they're actually distributing, weekly or have been distributing and giving to people that are coming up to collect those meals, how does that come into play with all these numbers that we're looking at?
Could you repeat the question, Brian?
No, I'm saying is like now where I know that people are able to come up and just get food and there's no charge to them or there's no cost associated with it. How does that come into play as far as, the meals and stuff are going?
Yes, that's where the federal reimbursement comes in because they've basically said meals are free and we will get reimbursement. So we will get money for each meal from the federal government.
Is there like a cutoff period where they're saying, we're done with that, or is?
Right now, I think it's December is what the date was. It goes through December. Whether they extend it or not is a question. I guess it depends on where we are nationally in terms of the COVID crisis at that point.
I have a couple more questions. Back on the state foundation, are we receiving transportation dollars in the foundation?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then
T1 report is actually due by the 15th. So tomorrow I need to go through and approve the T1, which is used as one of the bases for funding. One of the problems right now is that students are not back in school. So what we're going to show as the number of students riding buses is minimal or negligible. But they did say that as long as you file on time, the initial report, we can do a true up to it in the next month or two.
okay. All right. And my last question, when I look through here, from May, we've had some significant improvements in 3 categories or 4 categories, right?
Mm-hmm.
The health insurance, are we staying with the same carrier?
Yes.
Having that go from 9% to 2.5%?
Yes.
Estimate? And do we think 2.5% is a reasonable number considering that we're in a pandemic?
It's not going forward. No, that's why the forecast has 9% going forward.
So just in FY22.
Just for half the year, The balance of 21
Okay,
will have a 2.5% increase, and then the first half of, because it's a calendar year
sure.
for
Okay.
insurance cost.
Okay. And you're comfortable with that?
Yeah, and it's going to actually help us build our reserves back up in the insurance fund to the point where, you know, we should have anywhere from 1.5 to $2 million in the insurance fund by the end of 2021.
That's it. Thank you. Does anybody else have questions?
Not at this point.
Yeah, this is the front page of the kind of updated forecast with what I have in there now. Again, I think there's some more things to look at, adjust, potentially increase or decrease. But if you look at the first line for tax revenues, you can see that it's more smooth in terms of FY21 receipts, 22, 23, versus we had a large dip in the prior forecast due to the uncollectibles. So this is more consistent with what it normally would be. Added back some other revenues down, and all other revenues includes the TIF. So that was increased. Yeah, I'll provide some more analysis in terms of the trends and percentage changes at the next meeting or sometime before that, so that you can see a little more detail in terms of what's in the forecast. And if you look down at the reserve line here where it shows 5 million for FY21, that's what we had projected we wanted to increase it to for this year. And then it went to 8, 12, 16, and 19. So that would have been the projection, assuming we pass the levy down below on line 13.02. That would allow us to build up that reserve. Absent collection of those revenues, if we don't pass a levy, it's difficult to build a reserve when there's no funds coming in to support that. Short of cutting, you know, significant expenses.
Well, this certainly looks better than May, right?
Yes. And then the last page was the summary of the changes for appropriations, estimated revenues, receipts. Again, nothing significant per se.
And these are on the agenda for Thursday night's vote.
Yeah.
So no general fund appropriation
No.
changes.
No.
That's a beautiful thing.
Well, we probably will be making some, especially after the forecast is completed. Yes. Well, that's all I have for this evening. There is one other item I can mention. There was a runout reserve for the insurance fund, and I still need to get clarification from legal as to when we can actually reclaim those funds. But there's $500,000 that was sitting in this runout reserve, which is being transferred back to the district. That money would belong 80% to the district and 20% to the insurance fund. Again, I just need to make sure that we don't need to keep those funds segregated for any potential claims that may come in over the next 6 to 12 months. Typically, I think the legal period, at least in my last district, when we had this same situation and we converted from self-insurance to a group plan, a consortium, I think that period was 18 to 24 months.
Okay.
I don't think we've been out of this insurance thing for 24 months yet.
No.
Although the 2.5% renewal rate, I think we had built in 25% because we didn't know, we had a lot of stop loss, people exceed the stop loss limit. And so this is a good story. I think the healthcare fund is, in much better shape. So working collaboratively with our GJEA and Joe Grady, benefits, and Brian's on that committee. I think there's a lot of hard work that went into that, and it's a good story because our healthcare fund, we were underfunding it, if you remember, from the board side and the employee side, and things are looking good. And we may be moving closer to becoming self-insured. Right, Mike?
That's an option. Might not be my first preference, but yeah, it's an option.
Yeah.
We can discuss the possibilities, or staying fully insured is not necessarily the best option. A consortium, a healthy consortium, I think where you spread the risk and have much more purchasing power is usually my first preference. But again, we can look at those in the next 6 to 12 months.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions or comments on any of the 4 items, the subject of tonight's discussion? That's no for Matt. How about you, Brian? No for Burl? No for Brian. Okay. Well, I believe that's been a lot of work being worked on this 5-year forecast and refining it, and with all of the fluctuations that are happening with collections and economy, and so a lot of work has gone into this so far. So thank you. And I think one thing that, given our current scenario, we need to look at and keep in mind, board members, that budget reserve number. Our goal is 60 days because it does take time, as we experienced a couple years ago, when we didn't believe we were going to have enough cash when the state was holding their funds, and that we could make payroll. So we had to actually set up a line of credit, and that's no condition to be in. So the goal is to have a reserve so that we can weather storms like the health care issue and like the state pulling back 1.6 million or whatever that might be. And we can be a financially healthy district. So that's the purpose of that line item. So we'll keep working at it. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Steve. And to your staff. And that will conclude our Finance Committee meeting for October 13th. Have a great evening.
Okay. Have a good evening. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good night, everybody.
Night.
All right.
Good night.
Get out of here. Leave.